Imagine waking up on Halloween morning, expecting the usual tricks and treats, only to find a nightmare beyond anything you could ever imagine. This is the story of the Liske family. What started as a typical autumn day on October 31st, 2010, ended in a brutal massacre. William Liske Jr., a man tormented by mental illness, walked into his family's home and committed unthinkable acts of violence. His father, stepmother, and stepbrother never saw it coming, and the chilling events of that day have left scars on the community that remain to this very day. Now we shift to the morning of that day in the quiet rural town of Martin, Ohio, where the Liske family lived. William Liske Sr. was 53, his wife, Susan Liske, 46, and her son, Derek Griffin, just 23. The house they lived in became the scene of a massacre that would haunt the neighborhood, making it one of the most disturbing Halloween tragedies in modern history. As Devin Griffin returned home from church that Halloween morning, he was expecting a typical day. Still a teenager, he thought little of the eerie silence that greeted him when he walked into the house. After all, it was Halloween, and he assumed his family was just playing a trick on him. But when he made his way to his mother and stepfather's bedroom, he quickly realized that this was no prank. What Devon found that morning would forever be seared into his memory. Pulling back the blanket covering his mother and stepfather, he discovered a horrific scene. Both of them lay lifeless, their faces covered in blood. His mind struggled to process what was in front of him. He could barely comprehend the reality. His mother, Susan, and stepfather, William, had been brutally murdered. Devon was in complete shock, crying out and running from the house. In his panic and confusion, he hadn't even realized that his brother Derek was still in his room. Consumed by grief, he dialed his aunt, who immediately called the police. When officers arrived, they found the house drenched in tragedy. Behind a locked door, they uncovered Derek's body, his life taken by a different kind of violence, bludgeoned to death in his sleep. That day, the home Devon thought of as a safe haven was transformed into a nightmare, a place that would forever be remembered for the horrors that occurred within its walls. The scene that awaited investigators inside the Liske home on Halloween morning was nothing short of gruesome. As they carefully moved through the house, it became clear that this was no random act of violence. This was a cold, calculated massacre. In the master bedroom, William Liske Sr. was found in his bed, shot 5 times in the face and head. Investigators noted the precision. The shots had been fired from a very close range, between 1 and 2 feet, indicating that William had been attacked while he was in a natural sleeping position. There were no signs of struggle, suggesting that he was likely unaware of the attack until it was too late. Beside William lay his wife, Susan, also shot multiple times. But Susan's death revealed a deeper level of brutality. Investigators determined that she had been sexually assaulted before being shot 3 times, execution style, at close range. Her body was found in a distorted position, and a defensive wound on her hand indicated that she had tried to shield herself from the attack in a desperate final moment. The sexual assault compounded the horror of her murder, adding another layer of violence to an already unimaginable crime. In another part of the house, officers found Derek Griffin, Susan's 23-year-old son, behind a locked bedroom door. When the door was broken down, investigators found Derek curled up in bed, as if trying to protect himself. Unlike William and Susan, Derek had not been shot. Instead, he had been killed by blunt force trauma, likely inflicted with a hammer found at the scene. His skull had been crushed in the attack, with the first blow likely rendering him unconscious. The brutality of the hammer attack, coupled with the locked door, suggested that Derek had been the first victim killed quickly and quietly so the rest of the house wouldn't be alerted. There were no shell casings found at the scene, a sign that the killer had taken the time to collect them. This, along with the absence of forced entry, pointed to a premeditated and deliberate attack. Blood spatter patterns on the walls and bedding told the story of a crime committed at close range with a personal, almost intimate ferocity. Investigators also discovered muddy footprints near the back of the house, leading to a dock by a pond, where they suspected the killer may have tossed the murder weapons. Despite draining the pond, no firearms were recovered. Every detail of the crime scene painted a picture of meticulous violence, leaving investigators with no doubt. Whoever committed this atrocity had planned it carefully and executed it without mercy. The hours leading up to the murders were deceptively ordinary, masking the horror about to unfold. On the evening of October 30th, 2010, the Liske family hosted a casual get together with a neighbor at their home in Martin, Ohio. William Liske Sr., his wife Susan, her son Derek Griffin, and William's troubled son from a previous marriage, BJ Liske, were all present. BJ had recently returned from a week-long hunting trip with his father. Although his relationship with his family was strained, particularly with his stepmother, Susan, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The family spent the evening talking and sharing drinks. BJ, known for his struggles with mental illness, began drinking heavily as the night went on. Despite BJ's violent past and history of mental health issues, his father allowed him to sleep on the couch after the neighbor left for the night. It's unclear what triggered BJ, but sometime between midnight and dawn, he decided to act. A neighbor reported hearing strange banging sounds around 6:30 in the morning, likely the sound of gunshots that ended the lives of William and Susan. Investigators believe Derek was killed first, locked away in his bedroom. BJ bludgeoned him to death with a hammer, possibly while Derek was still asleep. The locked door would keep anyone else from hearing his final moments. After murdering Derek, BJ moved on to his father and stepmother. William Liske Sr. was shot 5 times in the head at close range, likely while he was still asleep. Susan suffered a similarly violent end, shot 3 times after being sexually assaulted. The brutality of her death suggested a deep-rooted hatred. Meanwhile, Devin Griffin, Susan's teenage son from a previous relationship, came home briefly to pick up his choir robe before heading to church that morning. Devin later recalled seeing BJ in the driveway, loading something into his father's truck. Thinking nothing of it, Devin left, completely unaware that his mother, stepfather, and brother had been brutally murdered inside the house. Devin's return home later that day to discover the crime scene would set the investigation in motion. His call to emergency services at that moment marked the beginning of the end for BJ Liske's freedom. As soon as authorities realized BJ was missing, combined with his history of mental illness and a history of violent behavior towards Susan, he quickly became the prime suspect in the brutal killings. BJ Liske's troubled past is a central part of understanding how this horrific crime came to be. William B.J. Liske Jr. was not a stranger to violence or mental health struggles. Diagnosed with both bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, BJ's behavior had long been a source of concern for his family. His mental illness was severe, and despite efforts to control it through medication, BJ's tendency to relapse and refuse treatment often led to violent outbursts. BJ's relationship with his stepmother, Susan, was especially strained. Susan, who married William Liske Sr., in 2001 attempted to establish order and boundaries in the home, but BJ resisted from the beginning. What began as verbal arguments escalated into physical confrontations. In 2004, BJ assaulted Susan during an argument, striking her in the chest. That same year, things worsened when BJ attacked her with a coffee cup and stole her car. Susan filed charges against him for felonious assault, but BJ was deemed incompetent to stand trial due to his mental condition, and the case was dropped. The pattern of violence only deepened over the years. In one particularly disturbing incident, BJ attacked Susan while she was showering, an act that left the family fearful for their safety. His behavior had become increasingly erratic and uncontrollable. Despite this, William Sr., BJ's father, refused to give up on him. He fought to get BJ the help he needed, hoping that with the right treatment, his son could improve. William even secured guardianship over BJ in 26, believing that as long as BJ stayed on his medication, things would stabilize. However, BJ frequently stopped taking his prescribed medications and his behavior would spiral out of control. He turned to alcohol and drugs, which only exacerbated his mental instability. Friends of the family recalled William's concern for his family's safety in regard to BJ, but William held on to the belief that his son would never truly harm them. This hope, unfortunately, proved to be tragically misguided. The tension between BJ and Susan was well known, and their violent altercations had grown more frequent in the years leading up to the murders. Susan had become the target of BJ's resentment, a hatred that eventually boiled over into the horrific events of Halloween morning. The discovery of the bodies sent shockwaves through the quiet Ohio community, and it didn't take long for law enforcement to realize something critical. BJ Liske, William Sr's son, was missing. Investigators had a growing suspicion that BJ was involved, given his violent history and the fact that his whereabouts were unknown. The initial search for BJ began almost immediately after the bodies were found. Investigators noted that the house showed no signs of forced entry, and Devon, the first to discover the scene, had briefly seen BJ that morning as he was leaving for church. A neighbor had also reported hearing strange, loud banging noises around 6:30 in the morning, what would later be believed to be the gunshots that killed William and Susan. With BJ's violent background and history of conflicts with his family, especially his stepmother, Susan, detectives quickly turned their attention to him as the prime suspect. His disappearance only fueled their suspicions. Authorities wasted no time tracking down leads, and it wasn't long before they discovered that BJ had fled to a family hunting cabin located roughly 170 miles away in Carroll County. This cabin had been a regular retreat for BJ and his father, having stayed there just a week earlier during a hunting trip. On the afternoon of October 31st, deputies located BJ at the remote cabin. He was found leaning against the porch, smoking a cigarette, as if unaware or unconcerned by the chaos he had left behind. When police moved in to arrest him, BJ did not resist. Inside the cabin, investigators found key evidence that would later tie him to the murders. A .22 caliber rifle and blood stains matching the victims were discovered in the family's white Ford truck, parked at the scene. The search for BJ had ended quickly, but the evidence against him was mounting. The bloody hammer used to kill Derek, the lack of forced entry, and the collected shell casings all pointed toward a methodical and premeditated attack. BJ had taken steps to cover his tracks, but the investigators were now piecing together the chilling sequence of events. After the chilling discovery of the murders, authorities quickly focused their search on BJ Liske. His absence from the family home and history of violence pointed to him as the prime suspect. By the afternoon of October 31st, just hours after the bodies of William Liske Sr., Susan Liske, and Derek Griffin were found, law enforcement located BJ at a family hunting cabin in Carroll County, Ohio, 170 miles away from the crime scene. The cabin had long been a retreat for BJ and his father, where they often went for hunting trips. When deputies approached the isolated property, they found BJ standing on the porch, smoking a cigarette, seemingly calm and detached from the horror he had left behind. He offered no resistance as officers approached him with their weapons drawn, and he was promptly taken into custody without a struggle. Inside the cabin, crucial evidence began to surface. Investigators found the family's white Ford F-150 parked outside. Inside the truck, they discovered blood evidence linking BJ to the murders, including stains that matched those of his father, stepmother, and stepbrother. Along with the blood, a .22 caliber rifle, the weapon used to kill William and Susan, was found inside the vehicle. further solidifying BJ's connection to the brutal crime. The evidence was damning. BJ's calm demeanor, the lack of any attempt to flee further, and the collection of physical evidence made it clear to investigators that they had the right man. The hammer used to kill Derek had already been found at the Liske home, and the rifle in the truck tied BJ directly to the murders of William and Susan. The methodical nature of the crime, the collected shell casings, and lack of forced entry pointed to a premeditated attack. BJ was formally charged with 3 counts of aggravated murder. His arrest marked the end of the manhunt, but the horror of what had unfolded would linger long after. As the investigation progressed, the evidence against BJ Liske became overwhelming. Blood found in the family's truck, the murder weapon, and the lack of forced entry into the house all pointed directly to him. Facing such a mountain of damning proof, BJ knew there was little chance of avoiding conviction. In August of 2011, less than a year after the murders, BJ pleaded guilty to 3 counts of aggravated murder. His plea was part of a deal that allowed him to avoid the death penalty. In exchange, the court sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The guilty plea spared BJ the lengthy process of a trial, but for the surviving family members, the sentence brought only partial closure. During the proceedings, the court highlighted the brutality of the murders, the calculated violence, the close-range shootings, and the sexual assault of Susan. BJ's mental health history was also brought up, with his long-standing diagnosis of bipolar disorder and schizophrenia offering a glimpse into his troubled mind. However, the court ultimately determined that BJ was fully responsible for his actions. His mental illness did not excuse the horror he inflicted upon his family. For the Liske family, the resolution was bittersweet. While BJ's guilty plea meant there would be no long, painful trial, the family still grappled with the loss of William, Susan, and Derek. The community, too, struggled to make sense of how someone could so viciously murder their own father, stepmother, and stepbrother. Although BJ would never walk free again, the shadow of that Halloween morning would forever linger over those left behind. The aftermath of the Liske family murders sent shockwaves through the community of Martin, Ohio, leaving many struggling to comprehend the senseless violence that had taken place. As the reality of the murders set in, questions began to surface about whether the tragedy could have been prevented. At the heart of these questions was B.J. Liske's long history of mental illness, a dark undercurrent that had haunted his family for years. BJ had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, conditions that had plagued him throughout much of his life. His mental health struggles were no secret to his family or to those who knew him. He had been in and out of psychiatric facilities, and there were multiple incidents in the years leading up to the murders where his behavior had become violent. Despite these warning signs, BJ had frequently gone off his prescribed medications, turning instead to alcohol and drugs, which only exacerbated his condition. William Liske Jr. had never given up on his son. He believed that with the right treatment, BJ could improve, which is why he continued to support him, even after repeated violent outbursts. But William's hope that BJ would not harm them proved tragically misguided. The murders highlighted the devastating impact of untreated mental illness, particularly when it is paired with substance abuse and a lack of consistent care. In the wake of the murders, the community of Martin was left grappling with not only the loss of the Liske family, but also the lingering question: could more have been done to prevent this tragedy? Mental health advocates pointed to BJ's case as an example of how critical it is to ensure ongoing treatment for individuals struggling with severe mental illness. BJ's history of violent outbursts, combined with his refusal to stay on medication, created a perfect storm that culminated in the horrific events of Halloween morning. For the Liske family's surviving relatives and the community at large, the tragedy served as a grim reminder of the potential dangers posed by untreated mental illness. It underscored the need for more robust mental health interventions, as well as the importance of taking violent behavior seriously, even within the family. Though BJ was ultimately held accountable for his actions, the legacy of the Liske family murders serves as a painful reminder of how untreated mental illness can tear families apart and leave entire communities shattered in its wake. The final chapter in the tragic saga of the Liske family came in March of 2015 when BJ Liske was found dead in his prison cell at the Ross Correctional Institution in Chillicothe, Ohio. After years of serving his life sentence for the murders of his father, stepmother, and stepbrother, BJ died by suicide, leaving behind questions that would never be fully answered. BJ had always been a troubled individual, plagued by mental illness and violent tendencies. Even after being sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, it seemed that he could not escape the weight of his actions. His death by suicide brought an end to his life, but it did little to heal the wounds left in the aftermath of his horrifying crime. For the Lisk family's surviving relatives, BJ's suicide may have offered a sense of finality, but it could never truly undo the damage he had caused. The community that had been so deeply shaken by the Halloween murders was left to reflect on the tragic loss of life, both the victims and, in a way, BJ himself. His death, though perhaps expected by some due to his troubled history, was a reminder of the deep mental health struggles he had endured, struggles that had ultimately driven him to commit such unimaginable acts. As we conclude this story, it's important to remember the Lisk family and the haunting reminder of how untreated mental illness combined with violent behavior can tear apart lives in the most devastating way. If you or someone you know is struggling with mental health issues, don't hesitate to seek help. There are resources available that can provide support before tragedy strikes. Let's continue to raise awareness, break the stigma surrounding mental illness, and ensure that help is available for those in need. Tragedies like the Lisk family murders don't have to happen. If we work together to understand and support mental health, we can prevent future horrors from unfolding.